So, thank you very much. I think you almost made it, so only one presentation left. I will try to make it a journey as good as possible, and yeah, let's get started. So, at the end of this session, my ambition is to kind of inject into your brain four things. First of all, when we talk about data analytics and AI is of course a much nicer word, but that you understand it is a foundation of our digital business, and I will go into that why this is so important. The second is it's a journey, so it's not like this one-off, just buy a box and it's done. I will also show that technology is one thing you can get access, and you might have heard also today that it's getting easier and easier to get access, but the leadership makes a difference if you really want to make an impact. And then, yeah, I would say the most important thing, people first. Very quickly about myself, I have a history in the telco industry, also a history in opposite the Baltic Sea with Nokia. That was also where I started to work on data. At that time we didn't talk about AI as such, we did it at that level as well, then telecom, but since 2016, I'm one of the founders of a company, Dane Studios. We are specialized on data science and AI, and that's more important than myself. We are now, don't count the people, it's not the last picture, but we are now 21 people, data scientists, data engineers, and strategists. We are working with various companies, various industries, from industrial all the way to consumer. We also have a kind of a small product portfolio. And I think what I wanted to now discuss in the next couple of minutes is a bit also sharing our experience about how the journey with a lot of these companies we worked with, how it went, what is the challenge, and also I think we categorize them a bit into personas. So if you are from a corporate, it will be interesting, of course, to sort in yourself which areas you are. To get started, I think it cannot be emphasized more than ever. There's an exponential growth. I think it might not feel every day that is something really kind of pressing, but sometimes it looks linear, but it's far more kind of aggressive. You can debate about the kind of the multiplier, but if you just look into a couple of examples, and that's for example from Airbus, if you take 3D printing, it has kind of accelerated 400 times in the last 7 years. If you think about drones, there's one here, I think it has accelerated 140 times in the last six years. Or then on the left, kind of sensors, LiDAR for example, which is very important for autonomous driving, kind of also more than 200 times. So a lot of changes, a lot of things, a lot of moving parts. And I think there's also one rule, at least I embraced in the last couple of years. So in the past, and you have seen my history. I think I'm kind of coming from this big elephant company world. I learned that in the past, of course, big was beautiful and big was kind of a big asset. But I think nowadays it's speed, it's fast. So if you're not fast, you can be big, but you need to be fast. Otherwise, you will be eaten if you're a slow one. So that is more like setting the foundation. The reason why, and I will come to that in a couple of minutes, the reason why I started with the digital and overall this kind of exponential changes, because that's also our experience, what we see every day in the work we do, that it has a huge implication also on the data side. But of course, when we talk about transformation, there have been massive changes in the last couple of months. You will find people which saying, but I did kind of machine learning algorithms already 30 years ago, 20 years ago. That's true. But I think there have been massive changes in the last couple of months. We talk about massive data sets, also the availability of these massive data sets. Not only that they are existing, but also they are accessible. We also, of course, talk about kind of processing power. And we also talk about orthogonal data sets, for example, the combination of sets. And I think that's also what we experience more than ever, is that very different industries kind of start to work together because they share a kind of, for example, certain information, certain events which make a big difference for a business. It can be a telco working with a railway company. It could be a pharmaceutical company working with weather data, because it can have implication to a lot of kind of the decisions. And of course, I think going forward, the ability to take decision data-driven, it has been kind of a great development, and that's obviously also something which I think going forward is something which will further evolve and will make a difference between the different industries and players of the industry. And then, of course, not only optimizing your current business, but also it's the source of a lot of innovation, which I'll come into a minute. Having said that, of course, we also see this at the moment. So talking about big data is not cool anymore. So the orange line, it was cool, but now it's not cool anymore. We talk about AI. And that's also our experience with a lot of our clients. We have clients which say, yeah, we don't do anything in the AI. And actually, we have some cases where they do a lot, but the senior management is not aware of. We also have cases where people claim they do already a lot and they don't. As such, honestly, it doesn't matter, because, and this is the fundamentals also of this presentation, it's about the business impact. It's not about kind of claiming. But as it said here, kind of very popular in claiming in earning calls that the company does AI. Of course, there's a lot of kind of use cases in all areas. We talk about manufacturing, travel. If we talk about, for example, in the area of manufacturing, predictive maintenance is a very kind of driving use case. Healthcare, diagnosis, even kind of drug development is something of the fundamentals, which kind of allows kind of completely new ways of identifying, for example, compounds or kind of the ingredients of future drugs, but all the way, for example, to the clinical trial and optimizing that. Retail is a quite kind of common one. Obviously, Amazon as an example, and the financial services, starting from fraud detection all the way, obviously, to new services, bots, and so forth. Having said that, so there's a tremendous amount of opportunities on the use case side, but I think equally important is to think about kind of the underlying data set. And quite often there's a lot of talk about kind of the top end, you could say the top of the iceberg, but not that much about the data. For us, there's actually these two dimensions. So I think there's the dimension of current business and future business, and then there's the dimension of internal data and external data. So of course, a lot of the opportunities start with the internal data in the current business. So optimizing what you can do. Then, of course, sometimes, for example, think about logistics. Utilizing external data on top of your own can be a benefit. Traffic information to do the routing of your trucks and so on is an example. The very kind of interesting opportunities are obviously the top ones. So one, of course, in the direction of data partnerships. I will show some examples there, and the other one is, of course, data as a business. So, of course, more and more companies which have kind of a rich set of data also think about how they can monetize it going forward. But if we start with, I think one of the kind of most prominent cases are this kind of business optimization, and quite often is this sentence about the power of 1%. Imagine you're kind of you're running, for example, in this case, kind of assets like these trains and so on, which kind of cost hundreds of millions of euros. Of course, if you can run the same service, the same capacity with a limited set of trains, is kind of a massive kind of opportunity to save. For example, Siemens, as an example, they partially not selling trains and wagons anymore. They are selling capacity, and it's up to them, and based on their algorithms, to optimize the amount of trains and wagons they are kind of taking into use. And it also includes, of course, the whole service maintenance and so on. So this is also usually the cases which makes you very popular with your CFO, because if you can show that you are able to improve by 1%, he immediately knows what it means in terms of value. Having said that, of course, it helps you to get more efficient, it helps you to kind of get your costs down, but does it help you to kind of build your future? It is, of course, more difficult. So more and more, if you think about services, it's kind of the whole way of kind of embedding the data part into your into your development. And while this is the classical, you could say, MVP, design thinking approach, I think what it is interesting, and I think for me also kind of having some experience in this area as well, is to learn how can you embed data right from the beginning. Because obviously you also, if you, for example, have a cold start, if your service starts with no existing data sets, then you also need to think in your conceptual phase, then also how do you generate the data you need for doing personalization. If you, for example, want to develop a service which is about kind of helping people to really get relief from stress, the first thing you need to answer is about how do you know that somebody is stressed? And then you need to start thinking about what kind of sensors could you use if you don't want to kind of ask questions. So I think this process, which was heavily kind of related to design thinking and MVP, you could say more and more there's a data layer under it. And having said that, the data layer, it also shows now kind of how you can approach the solution development in very different ways, and also you can see how impactful data can be. On the one hand side, you see Tesla. On the other hand side, you see kind of close to Munich, BMW. The difference is Tesla is using kind of the whole kind of fleet of cars in the market to utilize the sensor data that kind of they're uploading it and they're using it to develop their algorithms for autonomous driving. On the BMW side, as you can see here, they have this kind of specialized cars driven by engineers starting on Monday morning to Friday usually on the highway. Of course, they capture more and more, kind of much more data, more detailed data with more sensors. But I think the scale is that, so it's kind of 50 engineers against 300,000 still growing is a challenge. And I think that will kind of define who is faster in developing and optimizing algorithms. So one thing is, of course, have smart people to develop the algorithms. The other thing is also having access to massive sets of data. So if you talk about data, and that's a example out of the, for example, out of the utility areas, is of course in the consumer business it starts with the core of the operation. For example, also telcos are very very similar. You have, for example, demographics, whatever you know about the user. Of course, it's also important that you have the consent, that you know how you can interact with the person. Ideally, you have contracts, which also helps you to kind of optimize the data quality. And then more and more, the next layer is, of course, what you can do yourself. What kind of is under your control? You can think about smart home, smart meters, and offering related to that. But obviously, it gets more interested if you also are able to kind of embed it into the ecosystem. You're not alone on the planet. Your house is somehow kind of embedded, and I think that brings us then also to this kind of smart factories, smart cities. And I think smart in that sense for me always means that you are interacting with an ecosystem which you can't control. There are other players which you need to work with, which makes it very difficult because that means it's not only up to you how to maximize the value and how to create kind of consumer benefit. It is also up to your partner and the level and the interaction model, how you partner. And I think this sounds very straightforward, but I think this is one of the biggest challenges for a company. Sometimes it's driven by kind of concern that somebody else might be smarter in utilizing the data. Sometimes it's just very difficult to kind of overcome all the contractual topics. But imagine kind of a smart building. Nobody, even a kind of a big player providing building technology, will be able to provide all services by themselves. So there need to be kind of new levels of partnership. And obviously, there's a lot of discussion and linkages to technologies like blockchain and others to make that happening. Of course, the opportunity of data is also to go away, and I mentioned this kind of case with the trains and the wagons. Instead of selling products, you're selling solutions. Instead of selling a drilling machine, you're selling the access to a drilling machine. Obviously, to really optimize this model, you will only be able to do that if you have kind of sufficient kind of amount of data and you really understand how you make this model work. So whenever you think about sharing economy, services where you don't own a product anymore, it lives and dies with the ability to kind of manage your business model with the data, underlying data. So you need to do the right thing, but I think one of the biggest challenges is also to do it at the right time. And that's quite often in what we see, that of course now there's a lot of initiatives in, we should do some kind of AI pilots, we should do some kind of data related use cases, but it's a long route, and I think the big risk is that you start very ambitious, but then you're running out of steam at the point where it starts to pick up. And I think this is also one of the big things, back to the initial slide about where leadership is really important. And it's not a very easy question to be answered, but you need to really kind of interact and iterate with that model from day one going forward. So having said that, so we, as mentioned, we work now with very different industries, with very different players, different sizes, usually kind of medium to large enterprises. And by doing that, we actually have identified, and that's not sophisticated, but we have identified different company personas, how they relate to the challenge of transformation, how they relate to data. As such, as said, very unscientific, we have this kind of we identified these six personas, and now it's of course up to you to figuring out which one you are belonging. The one we are calling actually the black box optimist. So they are really now excited about AI and about kind of lots of the platforms, name it TensorFlow, name it IBM Watson, Salesforce, Einstein, SAP HANA. So really kind of course, platforms which very powerful platform, very promising, but people are kind of overestimating that the machine will now kind of overcome all the complexity, overcome all kind of the other issues and so on. So just kind of focusing on technology will not make the trick. The second one kind of are personas which are drowning in details. So they try to now, in a market which is highly dynamic, which is kind of move with lots of moving parts, they still try to kind of now trying to nail down every element. So we need to have the business strategy, the digital strategy, technology strategy. We should have a chief digital officer or data officer. So a lot of things need to happen first, and you try to write it down in all the details. And you need to have a business case for the next 5 years where you already sense that maybe half a year later it's already kind of not the same. And I think the point is you're trying to kind of simplifying a complexity, and actually what you do is actually exactly the opposite. You're adding kind of additional layers, and the biggest kind of risk you're running into is that you don't take any decision and you're stagnating, not going forward. We also have the pessimists, which kind of coming and saying that, oh no, we don't have anything, we have tried it, it failed 3 years ago. So quite often we get this kind of, you know, those kind of failure stories in part of the onboarding that it's quite often, yeah, you learn the name about this project very soon, and sometimes it leads to, yeah, it's anyhow very difficult, so let's do something very small and start with this one. But of course, this means that you're not really kind of offensively kind of grabbing the opportunities. It means you try to do here and there, and worst case is you have this pilotitis, that you have a lot of small little pilots, but none of them is really able to scale, because whenever it's about scaling and bigger investments, you are pessimistic that it will work out. You might have kind of too high ambition that the return and the risk need to be very low. The other one, and I think this is something kind of, yeah, we call it no rush. I would say that's interesting. So we're operating kind of in Finland, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and the Netherlands at the moment. And I think it's quite interesting to see, for example, the Finnish market is very mature in terms of digitalization. I think very similar to here. While in Germany, this is still kind of a very slow process. Try to kind of pay your cap with a credit card might be an issue, and so forth. And that's also reflected into the company. So while they are partially behind, the other thing is they're also not really, a lot of companies are still kind of, you could say, doing too well. So they see that things are changing, they see that they need to kind of adapt, but as soon as it's getting a bit more complicated or they would need to change, quite often then they kind of slow it down, or they externalize things and so on. And obviously, so it's more like driven by the potential threat. So would my position be kind of endangered, or would it be kind of would I need to change? Would I need to learn something new? So quite often you see that there's kind of instead of seeing the opportunity, it's rather seeing kind of I want to maintain my current environment, and then covering our backs. I think that's of course also I think in a way that where companies are not really secure and the leaders of or the responsible people of in this area are not 100% sure if it will work out. And then it feels a bit, of course, more safe to work with established kind of players, because at the end, if you're concerned that it doesn't work out, of course, it might be somebody will come back to you and saying, why have you worked now with kind of a small player? Why didn't you work kind of with the established smart people from kind of big consultancies? The main point is are not kind of if they are big or small consultancies, and I think the main point is that it doesn't help you if you outsource the thinking. It doesn't help you if somebody else kind of does the processing for you. Of course, you can get help to do the sort kind of the process, but at the end you need to change, not the consultants. And then, of course, the last one, you always need to have a good one, of course, and that's the smart ones. And I think it's good to see more and more companies start this one. And the most important thing is there's an ambition level, but there's also an understanding that this is a journey going forward. And having said that, it's this kind of three topics. You see one familiar. It's a lot about people. People can be the driver, but also people can be your kind of challenging also the development. I think the second thing is really it is a journey, and to get started this journey, you need to understand the journey. You need to. I think this is also, of course. You are the domain expert in your industry. This is kind of, we also see that in most cases, the use cases, how to apply AI and so on, this is quite solid, kind of embedded in the company. So it's not about that people lacking of ideas. It's more kind of that, okay, how to get it started. And that's also now the next part. So a bit walk you through. So if you're an enterprise, you found yourself in one of these personas. So how do you get out of this? And so I will share a bit about what we see as the key elements. So the top layer is the data vision and strategy, and I will go into that in a minute. Then of course you have the value pools, and the value pools are actually have kind of three layers. So that the bottom layer is the data; it's your foundation for the value. But obviously then the decision intelligence kind of. How to kind of you do data-driven decisions still in a manual form, but I think you stop doing kind of decisions based on gut feeling, but you start to kind of develop it based on facts you have. And then of course the use cases and more of course that goes into automation and scaling is then the next layer. The lower part is quite often very unpopular. Kind of nobody wants to talk about it because it's really kind of cumbersome. And quite often the starting point is, of course, a lot of discussion about the architecture, technology. Of course, it is an important topic because if you are in the business for quite a while, there is legacy which you need to overcome, and that's a challenge. It's a competence topic. Of course, you might not have kind of a lot of data scientists or data engineer or data architects and so on. So this is something which makes it, of course, more challenging to get it started. The interesting thing is that the DNA of your company is very, very critical, and I think at least our experience is that is something which should kind of be focused on and quite from the beginning, and I will go into that in a minute, because your culture and the leadership will make a big difference. It's less about the organization. Of course, at the end, it's about how the org chart will look like, but I think this is the minor part to be solved. So if we start about the top and kind of start about the vision, so it's less about, okay, how do you use data, but it's more like what keeps you sleepless at night. I think that's our main question when we start a project. We want to understand what are the business goals, where does the company want to develop, what drives the value, and then you look into what can be the role of data. The role of data can be very different, and more or less you could say. You could really say it's more like an optimization case. You want to drive your business in the most intelligent, systematic way. You see it rather in an enabler and so on. You're focusing on an internal data. The ambition level is in that sense much more radical because, and that's usually you could say also the pink elephant in the room, because you know if you want to reach this one, you will need to change your operational model. You will need to change the way how you do things, and that's of course a big thing, and it's also of course something which you feel insecure if it works out. So, and the foundation, of course, is that you see that data is a strategic asset. So this is kind of your secret source of the future. If you think about a company like Spotify, Spotify's portfolio of music is not necessarily different than any other music service. But what is their core asset is the billions of interactions people have done with the platform. So each of us could now license the millions of songs also Spotify has. It's a matter of money. But I think the thing what you can't copy, and also not copy with money, besides you buy Spotify, is really all the interaction, all the kind of algorithms behind that. And that's more like it's the competitive edge. And as you have seen also when we talk about autonomous driving and so on, the competitive edge is kind of what feeds your algorithms, and that makes you kind of different to others. So if you start with the vision, of course, this is also a way how you can provocate. Of course, there's also nuances in the middle, so you don't need to be now too extreme. But I think it helps to kind of sharpen your view on it. And then we talk about the use cases, and that's more like kind of snapshotting. There's different ways to go that. For example, if you're in the consumer business, it helps a lot to kind of start with your customer journey. So you have a vision about how do you interact with the consumer. And I think what this picture helps you is to understand that you only you are one company, so you're not kind of customer service, sales and marketing. The consumer will kind of interact with you on different places, and the most important thing is that you need to be consistent. And the only way how you can be consistent is that you have a 360 view of the consumer, and the only way how you can be kind of also driven by that is that you kind of have underlying KPIs. So one way to do that is really to kind of have the customer journey, and then you start mapping down kind of, okay, what is the motivation of the user in these different areas, but also what is your motivation as a company, what do you want to achieve, and then you derive, for example, the KPIs, and then you derive what actions you want to take. So we have companies which have more like an engagement issue, so that they have quite nice way to get people acquired, so they kind of having this first start. But then it's very difficult for them, for example, to interact. Imagine kind of a electricity company. How often do you interact with your electricity company besides paying the bills at the end of the month? But if you're an electricity company, of course you want to interact with the user, so you need to think of how you can do that in a different way. The other thing is, of course, now with the use cases, you will see you have a long list of different use cases. And then one of the challenges is obviously to identify where to start with. And there's, from our perspective, actually two dimensions. Of course, one is the potential axis. So you think about how big is the potential, how impactful is that use case. But then also, which is, you could say, more like then related to your ability to execute, is then the axis which kind of talks about integration effort. And when we talk about integration, it's less about now kind of, again, technical integration, but the ability, for example, to change to make that impactful. So, for example, imagine, again, predictive maintenance. You know, for example, if the elevator you are selling, and you're servicing it, you know, you can predict when it will break. But of course, the only impact will happen if you're able to kind of schedule your service technicians at the right time, so they will also fix it before it breaks. Otherwise, you will know with a very kind of 80% likeliness it will break, but the impact will be still the same. So this is more like, and that's the starting point. You're kind of setting the ambition and also being clear about where you want to go, what are your driving use cases. Then, of course, it's always important to understand where you are in terms of your company, so your enabler side. And this is kind of more like derived, actually, it's already a couple of years old, 2007, kind of initially developed by Davenport. It shows on the top level, it shows this kind of different driving forces, so sponsorship, fact-based culture, technology part, processes on the one hand side, and then on the other hand side it shows this maturity level. And what we do is we're working with the companies to identify where they are, and then we also look into where they want to go. And quite often, and this is this kind of stage 3, is something, for example, if you have a kind of more like a group structure, you have individual business units and so on. Quite often, the first thing is about, do you get these business units on this level 3? And then, of course, the question is, do you want to go one step further, that you really one company and interact on that? And as you can see here, analytical process is one topic, but I think very often is what is understood is this whole process about kind of how to kind of roll out a kind of, for example, a recommendation engine. And quite often, I think one of the biggest mistakes seen is that people think that the technical part, kind of licensing a software, integrating the software, is the bigger thing. We have a lot of cases where at the end, for example, we talk about marketing automation. The biggest challenge was at the end not the marketing automation platform. It was highly performant, best breed from the market. Data was available, not the best, but good enough. Data scientist has kind of built kind of targeting algorithm. The challenge was at the end to have kind of a marketing process which delivers personalized messages, because the process before was, I have a message if I launch a product, or I have a message if I launch if I have a summer or winter campaign and so on. But now, if you have whatever thousands of segments you want to serve, you also need to have thousands of messages, and that means the process, how you interact with the creative part, will be very different. And that means that at the end determines your speed, how fast you can go. But also, if you go more like into marketing is one, but this is a kind of a classical way how we kind of kick off a project, where the starting point is more, you set the target, you set kind of, for example, your MVP ambition. For example, in that case, it was about improving delivery quality. So the question was, you're losing a lot of value if you're kind of a logistic company, you want to deliver kind of the box at the home and nobody's there. Actually, you're losing almost all your margin. So the question was, can you predict how likely it is that somebody's at home? And can you score now every addresses in a certain area where you say kind of better to deliver in the morning, better to deliver in the afternoon, and so forth. And of course, the first iteration is not the perfect solution, but you start to iterate. You start to kind of drive this hypothesis. Can you predict that, and how good is your quality? You do the scoring, you do the kind of the measurement, you track it, and then you decide, is that something you can productize and scale, or is that something you further need to iterate, or you further, of course, obviously want to further optimize it. And this is a typical kind of starting point. Also, obviously, one of the first questions is a kind of initial data due diligence, that do you have kind of the foundation of it to run this. So this is a kind of a typical case how you get kind of going. Of course, I mentioned the technical thing. Quite often, one thing is, as said, the data strategy, but for example here, this is not secret because it has been also publicly shared. It's, for example, Airbus, that's their data architecture was there. So you see a lot of, actually it's hard to see, but there's a lot of different systems are interacting together. So now the kind of companies with a long history, different industries, kind of active, maybe also done certain acquisitions, that's usually quite often reflected in the environment, and that's your biggest challenge. So kind of you have these nice use cases, you have a good ambition, but you're also facing this situation. That brings us more like to this kind of triangle, which makes it so important to not only seeing that as a technical exercise, but really then kind of having those three ingredients also in place. The starting point is the leadership kind of there. It's not only to set the vision. That's quite often the misunderstanding, that the data strategy or the kind of vision development is initiated by the management. It's kind of prepared, you present it, they say it's good, it will be shared, intranet, whatever, video, and so forth. And then they tick the box and they go to the next point. The bad news is for data and analytics and AI, this is an ongoing journey. So yes, of course you can do the kickoff, but the management need to kind of interact with that topic ongoing. There will be a lot of trade-offs you need to kind of handle. The picture before showed kind of you need to make decisions what you focus on. You also need to make decisions what you let go, and this is a process which is a floating process. The second thing is that relates to it is the topic of governance. you need to organize, because quite often you have still kind of operations to do. So it's not like you're switching off the old system and you're switching on the new one. So you have a transition, and quite often this is the biggest kind of challenge. You have a limited set of resources. How do you allocate the resources between kind of what drives your kind of current operations, and how much do you invest into your future? And obviously the intuitive reaction, if there's trouble on operations, all resources from the future will be sucked into the operations. And that of course harms your future business. So there's no straightforward answer, but you need to have a systematic approach and clarity about on which level you decided. The last point is also, and I think this should be not underestimated, is and I mentioned that in one of the personas, it's also what's in for the people. So kind of why should people change the way how they do things? So you need to provide motivation. Sometimes it needs to be money, not necessarily, but it's of course also one way to, first of all, motivate people, but it's also of course data and the kind of the measurements behind utilizing this data allows you to do systematic. You can really track the progress. The downside, of course, maybe somebody would say it's a downside. It's very transparent, and sometimes I have seen cases where transparency was rather seen as a threat than an opportunity. Maybe in some cases, some old hypothesis or old beliefs what drives the business has been proven that there are other motivators or other drivers. So these things are at the end in the core of the engine, and while they sound very straightforward, I think they are usually the most difficult one for companies to implement and to maintain. I mentioned also, obviously, one of the big things is also you will need to have new skills, and this is more like the key roles we see, which are critical. As you can see, also a bit allocated to the different roles, so analytics strategists and data scientists. So for us, strategists is, for example, this translation layer between analytics and AI and the business. Both roles we clearly see on the business side. The reason for that is they need to be embedded into the domain know-how. They need to understand what drives the business, what makes the difference. We have seen cases quite often is that data scientists are allocated to IT, which means the risk is quite high that they're too far from the actual business. They might be forced to follow certain budget things. So it's more like, the business need to kind of set the requirements, and then the data scientist within IT executes. The challenge is the data scientist should be part of the requirement shaping. It's in many cases, it's for the business leaders quite difficult to really formulate what they're really looking for. So if you're expecting that they are very clear on the requirements, it might not turn out to be the most efficient way. As you can see on the orange side, there are a lot of kind of important technical roles. Quite often what we see, what is underestimated, is the data engineer. Sometimes it's nowadays also called machine learning engineer. The engineering part, really building the data pipe, because otherwise the consequence, what will happen if you don't have a good data engineering force, is that 80% of the time of your data scientists will go into data preparation. And that is of course possible. They usually have the background, but obviously it's not the most effective usage of your data scientists. And then you will see also nowadays that some of your data scientists might get frustrated and look for other opportunities. And then obviously consumer privacy, I think in the speech before, also GDPR is one of the animals, but obviously also related to security. Data, if data is a strategic asset, you also need to protect it like you would protect your money. Quite often, of course, for companies, it's a big discussion about how do I organize these things, and especially if you have different kind of business units. So one of the big questions is kind of, do you have this kind of hub and spoke model? So this depends a lot about how independent your business is. It's, for example, it also depends quite often how you get things started, and especially if you're kind of more like in the early stage in the maturity, then usually the kind of the embedded model is where you have a strong central function to get things started. Helps a lot because you have more flexibility to allocate the data science resources to the different units. As such, of course, your ultimate goal is that all your business units are seeing such big value into the function that they will more and more kind of kind of invest into that and have more data scientists on it. So, and I think this is also what you see in the maturity of companies, that obviously companies like Google, Facebook, but also Amazon, or Spotify and others, they have kind of quite a large set of different roles. Of course, also the roles of, it's kind of has more varieties. You have more visualization specialists, you have more people working on the algorithms and so on, and quite often you also start to have this kind of more like innovation team, AI lab team and so on. As said, it's one thing is to have the specialists on board. The second thing is also to organize them, but the last one is you also need to build the analytics culture. So the biggest mistake you can do is to outsource now analytic thinking. Yeah, we have now hired these data scientists, so they need to take care. So one thing, and that was the picture already before, is killing this kind of the silos. I think the maximum is obviously kind of utilizing data all over. And I think while it says analytics culture, we have seen a lot of cases where data is seen as a kind of something which I need to protect. I don't want to share it with my own organization. So it's not seen as a company thing. It's seen as I'm the owner of this kind of business process. Therefore, it's my data. And quite often you can hear all kind of excuses why it's impossible to kind of share this data. Others will not understand what this data is all about. The context is not clear. There's usually a different root cause behind, and it's the biggest mistake for a company to allow that. The kind of the ambition level should to turn it around and saying actually data is kind of owned by the company. There are people who are managing it. There are people who are kind of enriching it. But that is the driving force. Second thing is kind of, as I said, this leadership, lead from the top and the middle. Quite often the middle is left out, so there you have the specialists on kind of working on data science project. You have the leadership team quite strong, believing into it, but then you leave out the middle layer. And the middle layer can be quite important because for them it's also quite often a kind of a new challenge of orientation. Some of them see there's a threat because certain function will be kind of managed in a different way or organized in a different way. So it's important to highlight that one. As said, AI strategy doesn't stand alone. It's part of the business strategy. It needs to need to cascade down in metrics and in values, and also there should be the rule that nobody can kind of step out. Quite often there might be a business unit into a crisis and says, yeah, we can't do that. That's the starting point of again fragmenting your kind of initiative. And then of course execution. It's a long journey, but you need to be kind of effective. And that brings me back to my first slide, which I hope kind of I was able to kind of dive a bit into the topic, also highlighting what at least our experience is in terms of the topic, what makes the difference. As said, for me personally, I would see the journey and the people first as the most important thing, and obviously not to underestimate the other one. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hoffmann. Important to know, useful to know, but unfortunately we have a little problem with our schedule. So, kiire küsimus, kas kellelgi on üks küsimus, selle jõuame täpselt võtta? Kas keegi soovib Mr. Hoffmanni tülitada praegu väga asjaliku küsimusega? Kui seda küsimust ei ole, siis kinnitame veel kord aplausiga. Meil on hea meel, et ta meid külastas. Thank you.